Hi, Brian. I had not realized you'd written comments for me here. So quickly reading through them. I had my own, but yours are better actually.
I noticed you going on this. Yeah, let's just.
What were we looking for? Does it go? All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Economic Outlook 2024 Cost of Living, Housing, and Monetary Policy event. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jonathan Newman. I'm the Vice President Research here at Wilfrid Laurier University. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Laurier and its campuses are located on the Haldeman Tract, the traditional territory of the neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. This land is part of the Dish with One Spoon Treaty between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe, and it symbolizes their agreement to share, protect our resources, and to live in peace with each other. Today, this gathering place is the home of many First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and water on which Laurier is now present. Today, we honor the lives of missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirited individuals in Canada through the Red Dress campaign. This initiative at Laurier builds on the Red Dress Project, an installation of red dresses by Jamie Black, an artist of Anishinaabe and Finnish descent. For those of you who are with us today in person, you may notice red dresses on display around the campus. Participating in the Red Dress Initiative at Laurier is an opportunity for the university community to engage in learning, reconciliation, and allyship. Laurier is proud to foster a community that embraces Indigenous initiatives as part of its institutional identity, and as an educational institution, we are committed to addressing the legacy of harm caused by colonial practices, policies. Today, we're privileged to join together on this land to learn more about a topic of central concern to society today, the rising cost of living. Our special guests will talk about the forces that are driving changing in housing and the role of the 2023 interest rate increases. Every year, we host experts in economics to come here to speak to our community as part of Laurier's Economic Outlook Speaker Series. This incredible event is hosted by LCERPA, that is the Laurier Centre for Economic Research and Policy Analysis in the Lazaridis School of Business and Economics for more than 2 decades. For those of you who may not realize, LCERPA is an association of economists based in the Lazaridis School, and it aims to support and promote high-quality economic research. Would now like to welcome our event moderator, Professor of Economics, Dr. Brian McCraig, Director of the, oh, you're Director of the LCERPA right now, I didn't realize that, to kick off our discussion. Brian.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Today, we have the opportunity to engage in a conversation tackling issues around housing, the rising cost of living, and the Bank of Canada's role. I'd like to welcome everyone joining us here today, those before me in person, as well as those who are joining us online virtually. I'd also like to take a moment to welcome a few distinguished guests this afternoon. Dr. Lisa Keeping, Interim Dean of the Lazaridis School of Business and Economics, along with a great representation of AVPs and senior leaders from across the university. It's also great to see many of our Dean's Advisory Council members here in person and also joining us from around the world on Zoom. The format for today's event will include short remarks from both of our panelists, who I'll introduce in a second, which will lead into a panel discussion, after which we will end with a brief period, about 10 minutes, for questions from the audience. Following the panel discussion, I invite those of you here in person to stay for a networking reception just outside in the foyer to meet some of our current economics students who want to talk with you today about their research on these themes. Now it's my great pleasure to welcome first Rhys Mendez, Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada, and Diana Petramala, Director, Economic Advisory Team at the Altus Group, to today's discussion. So first is a brief introduction, one at a time. So Rhys was appointed Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada this past July in 2023. He oversees the bank's economic and financial research, its analysis of international economic developments, and he serves as the bank's G7 and G20 deputy. As a member of the Governing Council, he shares responsibilities for decisions with respect to monetary policy and financial system stability, as well as for setting the strategic direction of the bank. At the time of his appointment, Rhys was on secondment to the Department of Finance, where he was serving as Assistant Deputy Minister. Prior to this secondment, Rhys had been the Managing Director of the bank's International Economic Analysis Department. There, he was responsible for the management and strategic direction of the department, providing rigorous and timely analysis of global economic conditions, as well as advice on monetary policy and international policy issues. Rhys joined the bank in 2004. Throughout his career, he has contributed to the development of the bank's economic modeling and has been an expert in monetary policy framework design and international policy issues. He holds a BA in economics from York University and an MA and PhD in economics from the University of Toronto. I would now like to welcome Rhys to the podium to share some insights prior to our panel discussion.
Thank you, Brian, for the very kind introduction. So it's great to be here in Waterloo. Really appreciate the invitation. I'm really looking forward to what is sure to be a thoughtful and elucidative discussion today with Diana and Brian and all of you in the audience. I'm looking forward particularly to having the opportunity to chat with members of the community and meeting some of the students who are here today. And I'd really like to hear firsthand how the economy is affecting you. I know there's a lot of uncertainty right now. The cost of living in Canada is rising more quickly than most of us are used to. Housing is hard to find. If you can find it, it's far more expensive than what it was a few years ago. Some of you may also be worried about the economy and what the future holds. You may have student loans or mortgage debt and be worried about interest rates. I want you to know we do hear your concerns. We know high inflation is hard on Canadians. We know the cure, higher interest rates, is also tough to swallow. But our mandate at the Bank of Canada is really to promote Canada's economic and financial well-being. We do this primarily by targeting inflation centered on 2%. So why 2%? The short answer is that 2% is low enough that people don't need to think about changes in the cost of living much from one year to the next. And it's a level that allows households and businesses to plan and invest with confidence. Of course, we all know inflation is above target currently and has been for almost 3 years. To control inflation, we use monetary policy, raising and lowering our policy interest rate to influence demand in the economy. After being close to the 2% target for decades, inflation started to rise in 2021 and peaked just above 8% in 2022. Global factors played a large role in that initial surge as pandemic-related restrictions were lifted and economies around the world reopened, global supply chains were strained. Then food and energy prices jumped in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But high inflation was not entirely a global story. As the Canadian economy reopened, demand got ahead of supply, and this drove up inflation across a broad range of goods and services. To bring demand and supply back into balance, the bank raised its policy rate sharply beginning in March 2022. The good news is that it's working. Higher interest rates have helped to slow demand, and inflation has come down significantly from above 8% to around 3.5% at the end of last year. But the job isn't done. Inflation is still too high, and underlying inflation pressures are still too broad. For example, just over half of the price categories in the CPI basket are still rising above 3%. And core inflation measures, where we strip out more volatile categories, remain in the 3.5% to 4% range, well above our 2% target. As I said a moment ago, we know higher interest rates are making life harder for Canadian households and businesses. But while the path back to 2% is likely to be slow and risks remain, the target is now in sight. Our latest forecasts have inflation around 3% through the first half of this year, then easing gradually to 2.5% by the end of the year and reaching the 2% target next year. And with continued evidence that monetary policy is working, the discussions at the bank's governing council have shifted from whether our policy rate is restrictive enough to how long it needs to stay at the current level. That's the good news. Monetary policy doesn't always get it exactly right in the moment, but it's very effective at controlling inflation over the medium term. But now let me talk about two challenges that are central to affordability, but that can't be solved by monetary policy. The first is housing affordability, which is a significant problem for Canada, but not one that can be fixed simply by raising or lowering interest rates. The challenges in our housing market come down to a chronic shortage of supply relative to demand. Put another way, for years now, Canada has not built enough homes to keep up with population growth. To see that monetary policy isn't the solution to housing affordability challenges, you just have to look at recent trends in shelter price inflation. It was elevated when interest rates were low, and it's still elevated with higher interest rates. When the bank lowered its policy rate in 2020, demand for housing jumped. Unfortunately, housing supply didn't keep up with demand, and prices rose more than 50% in 2 years. This made housing much less affordable. Then the bank raised its policy rate to fight inflation, increasing the cost of borrowing. Higher mortgage rates dampened house price growth, but also eroded affordability through higher mortgage interest costs. So housing affordability was a problem with both low and high interest rates. The second challenge that monetary policy cannot solve is productivity growth. So for 25 years, Canada has been growing its economy by adding workers. More women have joined the labor force. We've been very successful at attracting newcomers and integrating them into the labor force. This is a really good thing. But productivity growth, that is how much more output you get from the same amount of work, has been chronically disappointing. So why do we care about productivity growth? We care because higher productivity pays for higher wages, and it's the foundation of a rising standard of living. Wages cannot indefinitely rise faster than inflation unless productivity also rises. For a period, businesses may be able to absorb the added cost of higher wages, but if output per hour worked doesn't also increase, at some point, businesses will likely increase their prices to cover higher costs. So if we want to see Canadian standard of living rise over time, we need to have stronger productivity growth. I don't want to scoop our discussion today, so I'll stop there, but let me wrap up with a quick plug for working at the Bank of Canada. I may be biased, but I think the bank's a great place to work and build a future. And we hire students, soon-to-be graduates, recent graduates from a wide range of backgrounds, not just economists. So I'd encourage all of you to bookmark our career page for more opportunities. And with that, Brian, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reese. I didn't expect that there was going to be job advertising happening here today during the event, but that's great. I would now like to welcome Diana to speak next. So Diana Petramala is a 2007 graduate from Lazaridis School with a Bachelor of Arts in Economics. And subsequently, she received her MABE degree, Master of Arts in Business Economics. And I see some of our students here today from that program from us the following year in 2008. She's the director in the economic advisory team at Altus Group. She joined Altus Economic Advisory in 2022, where she provides leadership on economic studies, policy analysis, and forecasting services. She has a broad base of expertise as a real estate and land economist with two of Canada's major banks, where she was responsible for forecasting and analyzing real estate and economic trends across Canada. In her 4 years before joining Altus, Diana was a senior economist at the Centre for Urban Research and Land Development at Toronto Metropolitan University, analyzing the impact of demographics and government policies on housing markets and urban growth. Diana also teaches housing policy at TMU currently. Welcome, Diana.
I have slides. It's not on.
Should just be the button.
Is this eating into my 5 minutes? I would just want to reinforce what Reese said. If I was a new graduate student, I'd probably be looking for a job at the Bank of Canada. I think some of my friends have worked there, the skills that they have learned and how that's carried them through their careers has been great. So I agree, keep an eye out on their career page. Now, I'm here to hear from Reese when interest rates are coming down.
We all know.
But I've been asked here
It'll work now.
to talk about housing, interest rates, and the cost of living. But what I wanted to do in my first 5 minutes was just talk about our outlook. I think the macro context is really important for what we're going to talk about in the moderated session. And we'll talk about affordability and what's been driving housing in those questions. So this is just the view on interest rates. I was hoping Reese was going to cover this in his first 5 minutes. We've seen interest rates over time come down significantly, hitting interest really historically low levels. 2010, that really started to drive home prices up. Interest rates have now come up and the housing market has slowed. This is inflation over time. And we can see that period, the pandemic, the massive boost in inflation, how quickly it was rising, and it's starting to come back down, but is remaining sticky at 3.4%. now. Here, if I wanted to, I put population first. So what's actually driving inflation, or what's driving some of these affordability constraints that we're having? The only thing I really can point to is population growth. So you're looking at the left chart is my left is population growth in Canada, hit 1.2 million in 2023, largely driven by the right chart, net immigration. 100% of our population growth is now coming from immigration. Some cities in Canada actually have negative natural increases in the population. So deaths are exceeding births in a lot of cities. So it's really, we need immigration to offset some of that decrease in the natural increase. One of the biggest structural changes here, you're looking at population growth by age. So yes, we're getting a lot of immigration, but we still have an aging population, and the fastest growing age are seniors. And then next we have, and this was mainly, I put down the demographics based on where they would be on the life cycles, on the housing cycle stage. So primary schools, we have a lot of young kids right now. We have immigration, families come, so kids come with the families. High school students are expected to decline. University students are going up. We hear a lot about non-permanent students coming, foreign students coming into Canada. And then we are seeing newly renters, 25 to 34, the non-student renters decline, growth slowing there. And then new homeowners, where that growth is staying stable and still relatively high. It's millennials, global millennials, driving the housing market. I guess this chart didn't transfer very well. So there's supposed to be two lines here. One chart is supposed to be the sales, one line is supposed to be the sales to listing ratio, and the other line is supposed to be the average home sales price. So it looks like this is the average home sales price here. We can see over time, home prices, we have really grown pretty moderately at about 5%, with the exception of 2008 to 2022, where they are hitting 20% year over year. In this chart, we're looking at the total debt payments of households. I split it out between total payments. So this is your total debt payments as a percent of your income on average in Canada. On the left-hand side, on the right side is the interest only you're paying on your debt as a percent of your income. And you can see that they've hit 33-year highs with that rise in interest rates, and it can increase substantially. So those diamond dots are where they potentially could go in 2024, given where interest rates are. There's a bit of a lag of when interest rates go up and when they hit the household balance sheet, just because maybe you're locked in for 5 years, 3 years, and then once you reset, your interest rates will go up. Now, there were some charts on economic growth that I think have not made their way in. Some of the things I wanted to talk about on GDP growth is that we do have high inflation, but the economy actually hasn't been doing that great since the pandemic. So if we look at the pandemic year, GDP fell 5%. It rose again by almost exactly the same amount in 2021 as you rebounded. But on average, if you take a 3-year period between 2020 and 2022, 2019, 2020, average GDP growth was about 1.4% per year, which is quite slow for the economy that usually is growing between 2 and 3%. And now we've seen a sharp deceleration in growth, and economists are calling for a potential recession in 2024. But at best, we're looking at modest growth of 0.0 to 0.5%. And then I was going to show a chart, and Reese talked about productivity, but looking at GDP per capita and how that's actually been declining for the last 3 years. So even though the economy is weak, and on average, we're becoming poorer and poorer. So that's just my opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Diana. And it's great to see slides with data. Makes me feel right at home. So I'm not a macroeconomist. These questions have been kind of crowdsourced from my colleagues, and we look forward to the Q&A at the end, where some of them might have some great questions for us. But we're going to start with sort of a question looking back a little bit in time, where sort of at the beginning of the global rise in prices, there were predictions by Team Temporary, where they thought that inflation was largely supply chain driven due to disruptions, global supply shocks, and that these inflationary pressures would subside over time without much monetary policy intervention. Now, Reese, you spoke about this a little bit already in your remarks, and just wondering if the two of you would like to expand on that a little bit more, and additionally, what you see as some of the global risks moving forward for inflation within Canada.
Okay, happy to start. Thanks, Brian. So, yeah, as I mentioned, I think global factors played a big role in the initial surge in inflation, but there was really a very broad-based increase in inflation, and that's really what we worry about, right? When we talk about inflation, we're talking about a generalized increase in prices, and even now, I said in my opening remarks, about half of CPI categories are running above 3%. Usually that's about a third, right? Because there's always some push and pull on inflation, some things running higher, some things running lower, but we've got a larger number of things running higher than normal right now. I think a few things on this. So, there was part of it was certainly oil prices, global agricultural prices increased sharply, and that drove up energy and food prices in Canada and elsewhere. One thing about that, though, is it turned out to be the effects turned out to be reasonably persistent, and when they persist, they can tend to seep other prices. Beyond that, the supply chain pressures. So we often talk about that as if supply chain pressures are necessarily a supply shock, and to some extent they were. There were some actual disruptions in production or shipping. But a lot of what happened during the pandemic was just really high levels of demand for goods. So people couldn't consume services. You couldn't go out to a restaurant, or you didn't want to, or go to the movies or whatever. And instead, people shifted to consuming goods. They bought more iPhones and cars and whatever. This showed up really prominently, for example, in semiconductors, right? There were shortages of supply of semiconductors that caused some auto plants to have to shut down. But why were there shortages in the supply of some semiconductors? If you look at production of semiconductors was not weak. If anything, it was strong. The reason there were shortages is that demand was even stronger. So strong demand created pressures on the supply chains. And so it wasn't the usual sort of supply shock that we often think about. And, all of this means that the pressures have persisted longer than I think most analysts thought at the outset. And now as we look ahead, I think there are risks on both the upside and the downside to inflation. I think, you asked about global risks on the upside. On the upside, I think the risks are mainly geopolitical at this stage. So, there's the activity in the Red Sea where there have been attacks on shipping that, right now, though that is raising shipping costs. There's shipping that's being rerouted instead of going through the Suez Canal, going around the Cape of Good Hope. That costs more because it takes longer. But at this point, the costs are not big enough that they're going to have a market impact on inflation the way they did during the pandemic. But things could get worse. There've been water level issues with the Panama Canal. That if it persists, the longer these things persist, the bigger the impact can be. On the downside, though, I mean, we've had a big increase in interest rates around the world in recent years, and that could have a larger impact than people are forecasting, and so you could see more slowing in the global economy, and that would translate into a more rapid slowing in inflation. So I think there are risks on both sides, but given where inflation is, inflation has been persistently above target in Canada and other countries. I think we need to be more concerned about the upside risks, because the upside risks would push us even further away.
Great, thank you very much. Diana?
Okay, I'm gonna use a lot of jargon. I'm gonna assume you guys all understand it, I guess. So I want to separate, I guess, the short term, the impact of the pandemic and why people started commenting on supply chain issues. And I guess Reese already said it, so I'm just going to reconfirm what he said. But March 13, 2020, it was my birthday, and my birthday gift from my partner was supposed to plan a date. And so I come home and okay, what are we doing? And he says, we're going to the grocery store. We went people watching. It was right before the lockdowns happened, and there was havoc. We went to a grocery store in a suburb, and people were hoarding things, toilet paper, rice, pasta, all the possible things they could. And we just watched. We didn't buy anything that night. And then Monday, March 16th, my partner's a trader. Market opens. I get a call. Diana, go to the grocery store, buy as many canned foods as you possibly can. The world is falling apart. So I did. It was a demand issue. We were hoarding. But if you go and look at the supply chain issues, I don't actually believe there was a supply chain issue. Imports into Canada structurally went up. We were demanding more. If there was a supply chain issue, we would have seen that somewhere in the import-export data, I believe, right? And we didn't. One thing that did go up was transportation costs. So I think one of the things that happened is structurally the economy changed. The way we demand things, the way we purchase things, we do more online orders. I don't think we have been historically over time shifting that way, but I think the pandemic accelerated that. And one of the things that happened is we order something and you want it within 24 hours, means containers, things shipping from China to Canada. They couldn't leave full. You couldn't wait for them to leave full. So it costs $25,000, $30,000 to ship a container from China to Canada, but you're not filling it. So that shipping cost per item goes up because you can't wait to fill it, because now everybody wants everything in 24 hours. So that's what really drove some of the shipping costs that went up. I think now there's a bit more research coming out of the US and the Federal Reserve, where as well we were on this coattail of, okay, supply chain issues are driving prices up, and then businesses just curtailed on that news item. Grocery stores, they looked at what's driving costs at grocery stores, and it's not so much that their costs have gone up, because food prices have been one of the biggest driving forces behind inflation. I actually thought I had a chart on price growth by item in the CPI, and before shelter costs, the food prices were rising much quicker, and the research is showing that it was more grocery stores were maybe raising prices in anticipation of prices, so they say, but really their costs really didn't go up as much as they thought. So they've raised prices, but their costs didn't go up, and we are seeing that in increased profits at grocery stores. So I think that there's some of that going on. And then again, population growth, income growth, the way things are changing, aging population, the supply and demand curves for individual items are moving. And we know that when you have, or demand curves are moving, maybe supply is not necessarily moving as much. And if you shift the demand curve to the left, what happens to prices? And you don't change supply. You get a price adjustment. Prices grow really rapidly until you hit your new equilibrium, right? So I think that's happening for a lot of markets, particularly as you have great demographic forces around the world, millennials coming of age into, and highest spending maybe years, people we're seeing mass retirement. The senior population is growing the quickest. And what does that mean? That means you have less people to produce goods with, and but at the same time, they're also increasing their spending as they have more leisure time. And some other changes that are happening. I lost my train of thought. So those are just a few things that I think are really impacting inflation pretty much globally. Going forward, what I think some risks to inflation are, I think downsides. There are downside risks to inflation, potential global recession. Interest rates have gone up, and someone yesterday was telling me, and I actually believe this is true in the housing market too, the impact on the economy is quite lagged. So the Bank of Canada measures it's 6 to 8 quarters, but we will see the economy really starting to tank about 2 years out. And so interest rates started going up in March of 2022. So March of 2024 is when I think you're going to really start to see the impact of interest rates on the economy. We've already seen it on the housing market. Home sales have come down quite a bit. It takes about a year for real estate markets lead economic activity. So it takes about a year for that housing activity to actually feed into an economic downturn. So I think there are quite a bit of downside risks to inflation in 2024. But on the upside, the risks then would be war and the impact that war might have on prices of commodities, things we import.
Great. Thank you very much for your thoughts on, sort of what was driving some of the inflation in the past and moving forward. I'd like to sort of focus the conversation a little bit more directly on housing and how it's affected by interest rates. And, we're wondering about, how the current cost of living pressures reflect the higher interest rates that have, been passed on to rising mortgage costs, right? As you indicated, this is something that happens with a lag. How this is maybe flowing through as well to rental costs. And additionally, how this is affecting the supply side of the market and particularly maybe institutional investors.
Okay. So Risa's point about the actual biggest issue with overall housing costs were not necessarily interest rates. It was at higher interest rates. It was the lower interest rate environment that really drove a lot of investment into housing. That pushed the price of housing and land up. The RBC calculates an affordability metric. So it looks at if you had an average income in Canada, how much of your income you'd have to devote to your mortgage payments if you purchased an average price house. And that measure in April of 2022 is about 56%. So you'd have to give up 50% of your income with an average income to service your mortgage on an average price house. And then since the Bank of Canada has raised interest rates quite a bit, first chart that I showed you guys, that ratio has only gone up to 62%. And in some cases, actually that ratio has come down because home prices have come down. So if you were to buy a similar home, quality home, say in Mississauga, Ontario, your actual mortgage payments, even though interest rates are higher, might actually be lower because the price of that home's come down already. So I actually think that the issues in affordability have been predominantly driven by the low interest rate environment and the demographics, and supply has not met up with, has not kept pace with demand. And rental prices is the same. They were rising significantly before interest rates started to go up. So I think it was more of a demographic force than it was an interest rate force. And actually, if you look at rental prices, the change in rental prices, they follow vacancy rates. So vacancies tell you how much availability there is of rental units on the market, and the tighter the market, the faster rents are rising historically. And the looser the market, the less rents are rising. So I think supply is a really big important part of that conversation as well.
So I think I largely agree with a lot of what Diana said. I think if you look at the contributors to above target inflation right now, certainly shelter price inflation is the biggest single contributor to above target inflation. Interest costs a big component of shelter price inflation. But if you look over time, you look in 2020, 2021, shelter And so now, you run the thought experiment. if the bank were to cut rates right now, what would happen to house prices? I think they'd go up so that because the effect of interest rate and is greater than the effect on supply. And so you'd see an increase. And then, so you wouldn't, that wouldn't actually help to rebalance demand and supply in the housing market. We really have to get at that supply problem. In terms of rental prices, I wasn't as industrious as Diana, so I'm going to assign homework. So if you look at chart 3A in the bank's January monetary policy report, it's a chart that shows population growth, and a significant increase in rental inflation. And I think that the takeaway is that with coming up against limit is driving a lot of that. In a well-supplied housing market, you should be able to absorb variations in population growth without large price movements. We don't have a well-supplied housing market. We have a housing market that's had chronic shortages in supply for years, and that's the underlying issue.
You asked about institutional investors and higher interest rates, and we've seen a lot of pullback in some of the investment decisions that our clients have been making. They're just a little concerned and don't, but for them, it's actually not the level of interest rates. It's necessarily, not necessarily the level of interest rates, but their supply constraints. So banks are a little bit concerned about what the year ahead is going to look like for housing. They're concerned about the health of commercial real estate investors and their financial balance sheets. So the credit has eased. It's harder to get your projects financed. So it's making it harder to provide supply. But what we are seeing where it happens is an interesting little trend, and I don't know if this matters, if it will maybe mean that we'll get a comeback, is vendor take back mortgages. So if people are wanting to buy a rental building or a piece of land where they can build on, they are relying on vendor take back mortgages. So they come at a higher interest rate, but they have access to credit. So that just tells me that access to credit is a bigger issue than the level of interest rates. So rents are high, they're still pretty profitable. As long as these projects are profitable, they want to build them.
Great. Thank you very much. I mean, the topic of population growth, has come up a couple times, and we'll plug some of our student research posters outside are also related to population growth and housing. So please take a look afterwards. But some of the components of population growth, as Diana, you pointed out in your opening slides, there are more volatile components than just natural population growth, right? It's immigration, temporary foreign workers, and international students. And we'd like to get your thoughts on, how difficult is it to forecast those components of the population growth, and thus, how sensitive are some of the predictions moving forward around inflation and housing costs to these more volatile population components?
Okay. Go ahead.
I think for me, the biggest issue in forecasting them is actually the revisions. StatsCan will, I showed you, we had 1.2 million in immigration in 2023, and StatsCan is probably going to revise that down to like 800,000 in a year or two. So the revisions are a bit more difficult. Population growth is probably not as strong as you think it was. But if you actually look, the federal government has targets for immigration, average targets per year, and we actually come in pretty close once revisions are made to those targets. So immigration forecasting is actually not that volatile. It comes in with, we come in within 1% of that target. So the federal government saying we're gonna target 500,000 in immigration, we're probably gonna get around 500,000 in immigration per year on average.
So I'm getting. So I think, the forecasting is I think that Diana summarized it well. I think it's also always difficult to forecast it's also always difficult to forecast policy changes. But I think the underlying issue again is that you don't want forecasting errors to necessarily translate into big price movements, right? And so you want the market to be robust enough that, you know, unexpected shifts in population growth within some range can be absorbed without big price movements. And that again goes back to the need for resolving some of the structural issues around housing supply, because that's where you see the most sensitivity to population growth. I think the other thing about population growth, so, you know, there are two sides to it, right? Because in a well-supplied housing market, and in an environment where we could ramp up housing production when we need to, you would expect that when there's an increase in the population, production ramps up. Yes, there's some temporary mismatch, but that gets resolved fairly quickly. And some supply and demand come into line. And you see that in other parts of the economy. Like we don't see shortages and big price movements upward as a result of population growth in other parts of the economy. In fact, we would think that, you know, over the medium term, population growth actually increases the supply of labor and therefore allows the economy to grow at a somewhat higher rate, but in a non-inflationary way because the overall supply of labor is higher. So I think there are really these obstacles that need to be overcome in the housing market in particular to address that.
Okay, just looking at the time, because I do want to make sure that we leave a little bit of time for about 10 minutes or so for questions from the audience at the end. I think we've time for a quick turn at one last question. Do you foresee any concern of the housing market going into like a 1990s style downturn where prices fall and thus, you know, the value of assets of current homeowners, you know, potentially fall enough to, you know, cut their consumption and lead to a recession? But, you know, trading this off on the, you know, the affordability of housing for new entrants. Do you see any risk in you know, sort of a decline in wealth leading to a recession through a drop in consumption?
So given the underlying imbalance between supply and demand, I think we have to go back to the fundamentals, right? And so you'd have to have, you know, we didn't come into the last couple of years with an environment where housing demand and supply were broadly in balance. I think we came in with an insufficient supply of housing to have an affordable housing market to begin with. So there's sort of a starting point gap. And so as we think about this, you'd have to have a pretty big flip in the supply demand balance to have the fundamentals move in a way that would support that sort of 90s type of scenario, in my view.
So it's not my view that we're gonna have a 1990s style crash, but we already have seen the same degree of decline in existing home sales. So in the 1990s, average total existing home sales fell from 30,000 to 20,000. Currently, they've fallen from a peak of about 70,000 to the bottom was about 30,000. They've come back up a little bit now, so let's call it 45,000. So we've already seen the same magnitude of drop in existing home sales. Home prices have already fallen 10% now year over year, 11% year over year. So we have seen, that was one thing the interest rates have done, has created or kickstarted what could be a drop in a downturn in the housing market. Now, how bad and severe is it going to be? I think because we have so much population growth. Like if I look at Vancouver is a little bit more isolated. Their economy is isolated from big swings in home prices to Toronto, so to places like Toronto. So I think that we've just seen, like, we can absorb that big of a contraction without having that big of an impact on the overall financial stability and our economy. One of the big differences between now and the 1990s, as I showed you the chart on home prices, was that we actually, like, even though people were talking about affordability getting really bad, it was very slow grind up. It wasn't like a consistent period of double-digit growth for a significant period of time, except for post or just before and then after the recession. And one of the things about housing cycles I remember studying, and I might prove to be wrong in this instance, is that the amount of time that prices go up for by double-digit matters. So historically, housing bubbles are identified by about 5 years of double-digit price growth, and that's what happened in the 1990s. And I know that chart I showed you showed that we haven't actually quite had that in Canada. They've been growing faster than income, but they haven't been growing at double-digit rates for a very significant period of time. So I'm not sure that I would be ready to call this a housing bubble and that we would get a 1990s style crash. Having said that, I do think there are risks that we could potentially see a 1990s style crash.
Thank you very much for your insights on the question so far. I would now like to invite questions from the audience. I think we'll have someone who can bring a mic out to people. So if you have a question, please put up your hand and we'll go from there. Okay. Yeah, David.
So, it's more for REITs. Let's imagine a central bank facing COVID again. Perhaps not ours, but they never make a mistake, all the ones in the South. Should they have actually cut interest rates as far as they did, or should they have let fiscal policy do its work?
Okay. Before you answer, I'm just going to repeat it for those of us who are joining online, right? It's just to summarize the question, basically, before another COVID-like shock, right? Should interest rates have been cut as far as they had been cut?
So I'm not going to get into the hypothetical because there are too many variables that like we don't know what they are in that hypothetical, right? So, but I mean, I think the reality is that policy was being made through that period in real time with limited and uncertain information. So, if you replay history with perfect information, maybe some things would be different. But I think, we start back at the beginning. So there were market functioning issues. There was a collapse in demand for some sectors. And so I think we'd have to I think we've learned about how pandemics work through this experience. We've learned about the fact that you get these rotations in demand from services to goods, and that causes a relative price adjustment. And that relative price adjustment can be pretty big and can have a persistent effect on inflation. I think we've learned that there are preference shifts, other types of preference shifts, including in the housing market, that can sort of reinforce and drive up house prices as people seek more space in that sort of environment. So we've certainly learned stuff through the pandemic experience that if we were to hopefully never face that situation again, but if we were to, I think would inform policy. What exactly we would do, I think, would depend on the entirety of the situation.
I don't know about whether they should have cut during the pandemic or not. I mean, my own view is maybe they cut too much too quickly and with uncertain information. But I do think the one policy error I do think the Bank of Canada makes consistently, the Federal Reserve makes consistency, and I think people have won Nobel Prizes on saying that they shouldn't be reacting to the housing market and price growth in the housing market, but I don't agree with that. I think home prices can feed into inflation in a lot of ways, but the biggest threat to price stability is inflation bubbles, and it is asset bubbles, or has been historically. So I do think that when home prices were growing much quicker than they should have been, the Bank of Canada should have been a bit faster to react to that.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you. We still have time for maybe another question or two. Yeah, go ahead. So just to repeat for those that joining online, so elaborating on some of the key considerations of the Bank of Canada takes in consideration when formulating monetary policy with, yeah, is that?
So of course, it depends on the particular situation. So right now, we're looking for evidence of sustained declines in inflationary pressures, sustained declines in underlying inflation. And so we're looking at things that sort of drive the underlying pressures on inflation. We're looking at things like the balance between supply and demand in the economy on aggregate. We're looking at wage growth. We're looking at inflation expectations. We're looking at corporate pricing behavior. We also, we try to look at a range we try to cut inflation in a range of different ways. So we look at a variety of different core measures of inflation, which try to take out the more volatile components. We look at the breadth of inflation, because really when we talk about inflation, we want to be thinking about a generalized increase in prices. That's what we're most concerned about. And so we look at how broadly based are the inflationary pressures. As I said, it depends on the particular situation. Right now, in those things that I've listed, which are sort of subset of things that we look at, we think that excess demand in the economy has been absorbed. We've moved into a situation where where supply has caught up overall for the economy on aggregate. And so we're in a situation of some modest excess supply at this point. So that sets the stage for inflation to come down further. But at the same time, inflation expectations have remained somewhat elevated. Wage growth is still running at 4 to 5%, which with productivity growth very weak, would eventually be expected to sort of feed into inflationary pressures. And if you look at the core measures of inflation, as I said earlier, they're running like 3.5 to 4%, right? So I think what we're seeing is some measures of some of these metrics have moved into positions where they indicate inflation is likely to come down further. But some are still showing meaningful inflationary pressures that we need to keep monitoring.
Yes, at the back. And I think this will probably be our last question for today. Okay. So just to repeat the question about the central bank printing money to finance government deficits, is that right? How much is that contributing to current inflation?
Maybe this will be where we can fight. Can debate. Actually, TD Bank, their economics department put out a report on this where they just mapped the increase in inflation to quantitative easing, full of money. So I do think that had an impact on overall inflation. So again, David's question of did they do too much during the pandemic to stimulate an economy when things were quite uncertain and it was very temporary is a really good question. But I think Reese can answer that question a bit more.
So I don't think there was any printing of money to finance government spending. And I think you can find all kinds of correlations that, I mean, we need to assess what the underlying mechanism is that's at play. If you think about quantitative easing was an effort to influence the yields on government debt. And so there was, I think we'll be debating how big that impact was for decades. But I don't think you're going to get from a change in the yields on government debt enough of an impact on inflation, on activity and inflation for that to be the main driver on its own. I think though the underlying thing connects back with David's question, which is, I think you have to separate out these things. So the way I'm thinking about it is I'm separating out the monetary policy aspect and the fiscal policy aspect, right? So fiscal policy took a set of decisions. Monetary policy independently took another set of decisions. And I think you need to assess the inflationary impact of the fiscal decisions, and you need to assess the inflationary impact of the monetary policy decisions separately.
Great. Thank you very much. Now, just to wrap things up, I'd like to invite to the podium Dr. Christine Neal, the chair of the Department of Economics.
Right. So, well, thank you very much to everyone for coming out to Economic Outlook, and thank you in particular to Reese and Diana. It was great to hear insights in the Economic Outlook. I would say when people hear about economics, what they hear is often kind of esoteric and full of jargon, as Diana mentioned. We hear about GDP and CPI and whatever's happening with the stock market. But at the heart of it, all of those things are about understanding what's going on with people's lives. It's about what their incomes are, how much they're working, how much they're paying for their housing and for their food. So I think it's a really nice thing that Reese has made the point that effectively understanding the Economic Outlook is understanding that, and that's understanding what's going on with you. So I would encourage everyone to take the next half hour to take Reese up on his offer to talk about your lives and what you see in the economy at the moment, and to talk to our students who have got some of their research on housing costs and prices and monetary policy up for display. So it's a small subset of the student research in the Department of Economics, but they've worked really hard on it. So do take that opportunity and join us outside. With that, I'll draw Economic Outlook 2024 to a close and hope to see you all again next year. Thanks very much. Oh, no, and I forgot the important part, which is presence.
Thank you so much for making yourself available.
I know, it's like, sorry, I'm actually